Hello, and welcome to Japanese Fairy Tales. My name is Elena, and I have some stories I'm going to read for you today. But first, I want to give you a little bit of historical and cultural context for what you're about to hear. It's no surprise to anyone that when cultures meet, they tend to absorb each other. We have evidence going back to prehistoric times of people groups meeting and exchanging goods, technologies, resources, political systems, even religions, so of course folklore is no exception. And there are many examples of folk tales that have been passed down in parallel versions through different cultures around the world that likely all stemmed from one original source. Now, most of these blending events that allow these stories to transfer back and forth are lost to history. But in the case of Japan, an island nation that went through periods of limited contact with the Western world, it's a little easier to pin down when some of these cultural exchanges started to happen. When Colonel Perry's black ship steamed into Tokyo Bay in 1853, Japan had been closed off from the Western world for over 2 centuries. And with the abrupt reopening of trade and political discourse that happened over the next few decades, as well as the Bakumatsu, the civil war in Japan that ended the shogunate, and Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan experienced a sort of craze for exotic European goods. And in the late 19th century, we see the advent of everything from Japanese photography studios to former samurai wearing bifocals. But this cultural exchange wasn't one-sided, because in Western countries, the sudden availability of trade goods from a country that had been closed off for trade since before America was an independent nation also triggered a surge in demand. And this wasn't just limited to things like Oriental-style furniture, although that did happen as well. Visitors to the newly opened Japan brought back bits of culture in the form of language. For example, in Western countries, especially in America, ladies' dressing gowns started being called kimono, even though they weren't what we would consider a traditional Japanese dress. The idea of a lightweight silk or silk-like material that was a robe that wrapped around you was called kimono, and that actually persisted in common parlance all the way up until the start of World War II, when, after Pearl Harbor, Americans stopped using Japanese words for everything, and it didn't really catch on again afterwards. You occasionally see it in older literature. They'll talk about a woman pulling on her kimono to answer the door, for example. But people don't really wear robes near as much as they used to, so I don't think the word is going to catch on again soon. But there was also, during this period, this is the Victorian and Edwardian era for the most part, there was also a rising interest in Asian culture in general and in Asian folklore, which was something that was starting to come over in bits and pieces. Now, most Western countries by this point were extremely modern. We're well past the start of the Industrial Revolution by a couple hundred years. And a lot of people considered themselves too modern and too enlightened to buy into things like silly fairy stories or superstitions. So outside of a few serious scholars, people like Lafcadio Hearn, who was a Westerner who moved to Japan and wrote and translated a lot of Japanese works and a lot of folklore. People are still using his translations today. But apart from people like that in a scholarly approach, most of the tales that were brought back from other countries during this period were couched as children's stories. And part of that was due to the fact that they were morality-type tales, much like we have Aesop's fables in the West. But part of it was also because children tend to... There's a little more leeway for children to have fantastic elements to their stories. But, I mean, in the Victorian era, we were still having serious debates about whether or not it was moral for adults to read fiction. So a lot of people weren't really comfortable with the idea of supernatural creatures or fantastic elements happening in their stories. But what that means for us today is, because then, as now, people tend to buy a lot of things for their kids, we have a decent selection of surviving books because there were a lot of children's books published of this sort of literature. And one of those is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. This is a book called Japanese Fairy Tales. It was written by Teresa Pierce Williston. It was published by Rand McNally in 1904. This is an original first edition. And it was beautifully, beautifully illustrated by a Japanese printer named Ogawa Sanchi. And there are these gorgeous page borders and full color plates and little woodblock prints all throughout the book. I really wish you could see it in person because it's a really beautiful book. But I'm going to be reading a few of the stories in this book. Now, because this was 1904 and because this is definitely marketed for children, it's written in a very kid-friendly language for the time, some of the stories have been slightly Americanized, by which I mean tanuki, which is a species that is endemic to but is unknown in the US, tanuki are called badgers in this book, or oni are called ogres, because that's something similar that children would have known from their other fairy tales. But apart from a few word exchanges like that, and a little bit of simplifying of some of the more complex stories that revolve around Buddhist religious elements or things like that, most of these stories have survived more or less intact and parallel their Japanese original versions very closely. So because these adaptations themselves are now of historic value, and because they are similar to the originals, I'm going to be reading them exactly as they are printed. I'm not going to be changing back and saying, well, actually, this word should have been this other word. So you are going to be getting the experience of a child in 1904 opening up a book on Christmas morning and having a picture book full of fairy tales from another land. And that's what I'm going to be reading for you today. So I hope you enjoy them. And I will insert a few of the illustrations in the video after I'm done so you can see what the pictures look like. And let's get started. So the first story I'm going to read for you today is a very well-known Japanese folktale about a tanuki, and this version is called The Wonderful Tea Kettle. The old priest was very happy. He had found a new treasure. As he climbed the hill to the temple where he lived, he often stopped to pat his beautiful brass tea kettle. When he reached the temple, he called the 3 boys who were his pupils. "See here," he cried to them. "Just see the beautiful kettle I found in a little shop I passed. I got it very cheap, too." The boys admired it, but smiled a little to themselves, for they could not see what he wanted of an old brass kettle. "Now you go on with your studies," said the priest. "I will hear you recite after a while." So the boys went into the next room, and the old priest sat down to admire his prize. He sat and looked at it so long that he grew sleepy, and nod, bob went his head until in a moment he was fast asleep. The boys in the next room studied very hard for a few minutes, but they were boys, and no one was there to see them, so you can imagine what they were doing by the time the priest was well asleep. Suddenly they heard a noise in the next room. "There, the priest is awake," whispered one. "Here, now we'll have you behave," said the second. The third one was more daring. He crept up and peeped through the screen to see if it really was the priest. He was just in time to see the new tea kettle give a spring into the air, turn a somersault, and come down a furry little badger with a sharp nose, bushy tail, and 4 little feet. How that badger did caper and dance! It danced on the floor. It danced on the table. It danced up the side of a screen. "Oh my! Oh my!" cried the boy, tumbling back. "It will dance on me next! Oh my!" "What are you talking about?" said the other 2. "What will dance on you?" "That goblin will dance on me. I know it will. It danced on the floor, and it danced on the table, and it danced on the screen, and now I know it is coming to dance on me," said the boy. "What do you mean?" said the others. "There is no goblin here." Then they, too, looked through the screen. There sat the kettle, just as it had been before. "You little silly," cried one of the other boys. "Do you call that a goblin? That looks very much like a tea kettle to my eyes." "Hush," said the third boy. "The priest is waking up. We had better get to work again." The priest waked up, and he heard the busy lips of his pupils. "What good boys I have," he thought. "Now while they are working, I will just brew myself a cup of tea." He lighted his little charcoal fire, filled his kettle with fresh water, and put it over the fire to heat. Suddenly the kettle gave a leap up into the air, spilling the hot water all over the floor. "Hot! Hot! I am burning!" it cried, and like a flash it was no longer a kettle, but a little furry badger with a sharp nose, bushy tail, and 4 little feet. "Oh, help! Oh, help! Here is a goblin!" shrieked the priest. In rushed the 3 boys to see what was the matter. They saw no kettle at all, but in its place was a very angry badger, prancing about and sputtering about the room. They all took sticks and began to beat the badger, but it was again only a brass kettle that answered clang, clang to every blow. When the priest saw that he could gain nothing by beating the kettle, he began to plan how he might get rid of it. Just then the tinker came by. "That is my chance," thought the priest. So he called, "Tinker, Tinker, come and see what I have for you. Here is an old kettle I found. It is no use to me, but you could mend it up and sell it." The tinker saw that it was a good kettle, so he bought it and took it home. He pressed it carefully into shape again and mended all the broken places. Once more it was a fine-looking kettle. That night the tinker awoke and found a badger looking at him with his small bright eyes. "Now see here, Mr. Tinker," said the badger. "I think that you are a kind man, so I have something to tell you. I am really a wonderful tea kettle, and can turn into a badger whenever I wish, as you see. I can do other things, too, more wonderful than that." The kind-hearted tinker said, "Well, if you are a badger, you must want something to eat. What can I get for you?" "Oh, I like a little sugar now and then," replied the badger, "and I don't like to be set on the fire or beaten with sticks. But I am sure that you will never treat me that way. If you wish to take me around to the different villages, I can sing and dance on the tightrope for you." The tinker did this, and crowds came to see the wonderful kettle. Those who had seen it once came again, and those who had not seen it came to see why the people liked it so well. At last the tinker became rich. Then he put his beloved tea kettle in a little temple on the top of a hill, where it might always rest and have all the sugar plums it wanted. This next story is called The Mirror of Matsuyama. In Matsuyama there lived a man, his wife, and their little daughter. They loved each other very much and were very happy together. One day the man came home very sad. He had received a message from the emperor which said that he must take a journey to far-off Tokyo. They had no horses, and in those days there were no railroads in Japan. The man knew that he must walk the whole distance. It was not the long walk that he minded, however. It was because it would take him many days from home. Still, he must obey his emperor, so he made ready to start. His wife was very sorry that he must go, and yet a little proud, too, for no one else in the village had ever taken so long a journey. She and the baby walked with him down to the turn in the road. There they stood and watched him through their tears as he followed the path up through the pines on the mountainside. At last, no larger than a speck, he disappeared behind the hills. Then they went home to await his return. For 3 long weeks they waited. Each day they spoke of him and counted the days until they should see his dear face again. At last the time came. They walked down to the turn in the road to wait for his coming. Up on the mountainside someone was walking toward them. As he came nearer they could see that it was the one for whom they waited. The good wife could scarcely believe that her husband was indeed safe home again. The baby girl laughed and clapped her hands to see the toys he brought her. There was a tiny image of Uzume, the laughter-loving goddess. Next came a little red monkey of cotton with a blue head. When she pressed the spring, he ran to the top of the rod. Oh, how wonderful was the third gift! It was a tombo, or dragonfly. When she first looked at it, she saw only a piece of wood shaped like a T. The crosspiece was painted with different bright colors. But the queer thing, when her father twirled it between his fingers, would rise in the air, dipping and hovering like a real dragonfly. Last, of course, there was a ningyo, or doll, with a sweet face, slanting eyes, and such wonderful hair. Her name was Ohina-san. He told her of the Feast of the Dead which he had seen in Tokyo. He told of the beautiful lanterns, the lanterns of the dead, and the pine torches burning before each house. He told of the tiny boats made of barley straw and filled with food that are set floating away on the river, bearing 2 tiny lanterns to guide them to the land of the dead. At last her husband handed the wife a small box. "Tell me what you see inside," he said. She opened it and took out something round and bright. On one side were buds and flowers of frosted silver. The other side at first looked as clear and bright as a pool of water. When she moved it a little, she saw in it a most beautiful woman. "Oh, what a beautiful picture!" she cried. "It is of a woman, and she seems to be smiling and talking just as I am. She has on a blue dress just like mine, too. How strange!" Then her husband laughed and said, "That is a mirror. It is yourself you see reflected in it. All the women in Tokyo have them." The wife was delighted with her present and looked at it very often. She liked to see the smiling red lips, the laughing eyes, and beautiful dark hair. After a while she said to herself, "How foolish this is of me to sit and gaze at myself in this mirror. I am not more beautiful than other women. How much better for me to enjoy others' beauty and forget my own face. I will only remember that it must always be happy and smiling, or it will make no one else happy. I do not wish any cross or angry look of mine to make anyone sad." She put the mirror carefully away in its box. Only twice in a year she looked at it. Then it was to see if her face was still such as would make others happy. The years passed by in their sweet and simple life until the baby had grown to be a big girl. Her ningyo, her tombo, the image of Uzume, even the cotton monkey, were put carefully away for her own children. This girl was the very image of her mother. She was just as sweet and loving, just as kind and helpful. One day her mother became very ill. Although the girl and her father did all they could for her, she grew worse and worse. At last she knew that she must die, so she called to her daughter and said, "My child, I know that I will soon leave you, but I wish to leave something with you in my place. Open this box and see what you find in it." The girl opened the box and looked for the first time in a mirror. "Oh, mother dear," she cried, "I see you here, not thin and pale as you are now, but happy and smiling as you have always been." Then her mother said, "When I am gone, will you look in this every morning and every night? If anything troubles you, tell me about it. Always try to do right so that you will see only happiness here." Every morning when the sun rose and the birds began to twitter and sing, the girl rose and looked in her mirror. There she saw the bright, happy face that she remembered as her mother's. Every evening, when the shadows fell and the birds were asleep, she looked again. She told it all that had happened during the day. When it had been a happy day, the face smiled back at her. When she was sad, the face looked sad too. She was very careful not to do anything unkind, for she knew how sad the face would be then. So each day she grew more kind and loving, and more like the mother whose face she saw each day and loved. This next story is called The Stolen Charm. A little boy sat on the sand at the foot of an old pine tree. "Pish, pish," whispered the pine trees as the spring wind swept through its needles. "Swish, swish," said the waves as they chased each other up the yellow sand. "Swish, swish," said each wave as it threw its armful of white foam at the foot of the boy. The boy heard the whisper of the pine tree and the splash of the waves, but he looked far out over the water. He was looking for the white foam fairy who came each day to play with him. At last she came, riding on the top of the highest wave. In her hand she held something which shone in the sun like a drop of dew. She sat down on the sand with the boy. For a long time she sat watching the waves and the sea birds and the soft white clouds. At last she said, "Little boy, we have played here together for many weeks. Now I must go away to another land, so I have come to say goodbye. Do you see this tiny silver ship I have brought you? It is a charm, and will always keep you well and happy." The boy looked up to say goodbye, but could see only the rainbow that gleamed in the spray of the waves. She was gone, but close by his hand lay a tiny silver ship that shone in the sun like a drop of dew. The boy picked it up and walked slowly to his home. "See, mother," he said, "here is a tiny silver ship which the foam fairy gave to me." "That is a charm, my boy," said his mother. "You must always keep it, for it is very precious." Then he showed the charm to his two pets, the furry little fox cub and the fuzzy little puppy. They sniffed and blinked at it very wisely, as though they knew all about it. Weeks passed, and spring warmed into summer. One evening the boy became very ill. His mother went to fetch the silver charm, for that would make him well again. It was gone! Who could have taken it? The furry little fox cub and the fuzzy little puppy were very sad. They sat in the dusk and blinked at the fireflies flashing among the trees. They blinked at the stars in the faraway sky. Their sharp little noses twitched as they smelled the sweet dew on the flowers. They thought of their poor sick master and wondered how they could help him. At last the fox cub said, "I believe the ogre must have stolen the charm. Let's go and see." "Oh dear, I'm afraid of ogres," said the puppy with her tail between her legs. "How would we ever get it if he did have it?" "Come along, we'll find a way," said the fox cub. They crept softly along the path which led up the hill to the house of the ogre. On the way they met the rat. "Where are you going?" squealed the rat. "We are going to the house of the ogre to see if he has stolen our master's charm," said the fox cub. "And I don't know how we'll ever get it if he has it," whined the puppy with her tail between her legs. "I'll go too," said the rat. "I know how you can get it. Just you wait here by this tree until I creep up to the house. When I am by the window, you make a dreadful noise and then run for your lives. I'll meet you at the foot of the hill." "Oh dear, I'm afraid," sniffed the puppy. "Never mind, he won't hurt you," said the fox cub. They waited by the pine tree until the rat was close to the house. Then they made a noise like all sorts of monsters and turned and ran for their lives. By and by the rat came too. "I know where it is," he cried. "He has the charm, and he keeps it in the pocket of his sleeve. I know it is there, for when you screamed he felt in his pocket the first thing to see that it was safe. Now we'll wait till he gets over being frightened, and then we'll go back and get it." Soon they were by the pine tree again. Then the rat said, "Now you, fox cub, change yourself into a little boy, and puppy into a little girl. Then both go in and dance for the ogre. Dance for your lives, and keep on dancing until I am down the hill again." "Oh dear, I'm so afraid of ogres," said the puppy. "Never mind, dance for your life and he won't hurt you," said the fox cub. Then the rat hid himself in the folds of the girl's long dress. The boy and girl walked up to the door of the house. "Please, Mr. Ogre, may we dance for you?" they asked. Now the ogre was very tired and very cross, so a dance was just what he wanted to see. He said, "Yes, but if you don't dance well, I'll eat you." They danced their very best, and the ogre was so interested that he did not see the little rat slip from the girl's dress and crawl under his sleeve. He did not hear the rat gnaw through the cloth, nor see him as he slipped away with the tiny silver ship in his mouth. When the rat was safely down the hill, the girl and boy suddenly disappeared. The ogre never knew what became of them. Like a flash, they were only a fox cub and a puppy, running and tumbling down the hill as fast as they could. They thanked the rat for his help, and they ran to their master with the silver ship. "Dear master," they cried, "here is your charm. Now you will be well once more." Sure and well, and lived long after after the furry little fox cub was a grown-up fox and the fuzzy little puppy was a grandmother dog. But the dog still puts her tail between her legs whenever you talk about ogres. The next story is the well-known folktale Urashima. Many years ago, a boy lived down by the sea where the great green waves came riding in to break on the shore in clouds of salty spray. This boy, Urashima, loved the water as a brother and was often out in his boat from purple dawn to russet evening. One day, as he was fishing, something tugged at his line and he pulled in. It was not a fish as he expected, but a wrinkled old turtle. "Well," said Urashima, "if I cannot get a fish for my dinner, at least I will not keep this old fellow from all the dinners he has yet to come." For in Japan they say that all the turtles live to be 1,000 years old. So the kind-hearted Urashima tumbled him back into the water, and what a splash he made! But from the spray there seemed to rise a beautiful girl who stepped into the boat with Urashima. She said to him, "I am the daughter of the sea god. I was that turtle you just threw back into the water. My father sent me to see if you were as kind as you seemed, and I see that you are. We who live under the water say that those who love the sea can never be unkind. Will you come with us to the Dragon Palace, far below the green waves?" Urashima was very glad to go, so each took an oar, and away they sped. Long before the sun had sunk behind the purple bars of evening, Urashima and the Dragon Princess had reached the twilight depths of the undersea. The fishes scuttled about them through branches of coral and trailing ropes of seaweed. The roar of the waves above came to them only as a trembling murmur to make the silence sweeter. Here was the Dragon Palace of seashell and pearl, of coral and emerald. It gleamed with all the 1,000 lights and tints that lurk in the depths of the water. Fishes with silver fins were ready to come at their wish. The daintiest foods that the ocean holds for her children were served to them. Their waiters were 7 dragons, each with a golden tail. Urashima lived in a dream of happiness with the Dragon Princess for 4 short years. Then he remembered his home and longed to see his father and his kindred once again. He wished to see the village streets and the wave-lapped stretch of sand where he used to play. He did not need to tell the princess of his wish, for she knew it all, and said, "I see that you long for your home once more. I will not keep you, but I fear to have you go. Still, I know you will wish to come back, so take this box and let nothing happen to it, for if it is opened you can never return." She then placed him in his boat, and the lapping waves bore him up and away until his prow crunched on the sand where he used to play. Around that bend in the bay stood his father's cottage, close by the great pine tree. But as he came nearer, he saw neither tree nor house. He looked around. The other houses, too, looked strange. Strange children were peering at him. Strange people walked the streets. He wondered at the change in 4 short years. An old man came along the shore. To him Urashima spoke. "Can you tell me, sir, where the cottage of Urashima has gone?" "Urashima?" said the old man. "Urashima? Why, don't you know that he was drowned 400 years ago while out fishing? His brothers, their children, and their children's children have all lived and died since then. 400 years ago it was, on a summer day like this, they say." Gone! His father and mother, his brothers and playmates, and the cottage he loved so well. How he longed to see them! But he must hurry back to the Dragon Palace, for now that was his only home. But how should he go? He walked along the shore, but could not remember the way to take. Forgetting the promise he had made to the princess, he took out the little pearl box and opened it. From it a white cloud seemed to rise, and as it floated away he thought he saw the face of the Dragon Princess. He called to her, reached for her, but the cloud was already floating far out over the waves. As it floated away, he suddenly seemed to grow old. His hands shook, and his hair turned white. He seemed to be melting away to join the past in which he had lived. When the new moon hung her horn of light in the branches of the pine tree, there was only a small pearl box on the sandy rim of shore, and the great green waves were lifting white arms of foam, as they had done 400 years before. This story is The Tongue Cut Sparrow. In a little old house in a little old village in Japan lived a little old man and his little old wife. One morning, when the old woman slid open the screens which form the sides of all Japanese houses, she saw on the doorstep a poor little sparrow. She took him up gently and fed him. Then she held him in the bright morning sunshine until the cold dew was dried from his wings. Afterward she let him go that he might fly home to his nest, but he stayed to thank her with his songs. Each morning, when the pink on the mountain tops told that the sun was near, the sparrow perched on the roof of the house and sang out his joy. The old man and woman thanked the sparrow for this, for they liked to be up early and at work. But near them there lived a cross old woman who did not like to be awakened so early. At last she became so angry that she caught the sparrow and cut his tongue. Then the poor little sparrow flew away to his home, but he could never sing again. When the kind woman knew what had happened to her pet, she was very sad. She said to her husband, "Let us go and find our poor little sparrow." So they started together and asked of each bird by the wayside, "Do you know where the Tongue Cut Sparrow lives? Do you know where the Tongue Cut Sparrow went?" In this way they followed until they came to a bridge. They did not know which way to turn, and at first could see no one to ask. At last they saw a bat hanging head downward, taking his daytime nap. "Oh, friend Bat, do you know where the Tongue Cut Sparrow went?" they asked. "Yes, over the bridge and up the mountain," said the Bat. Then he blinked his sleepy eyes and was fast asleep again. They went over the bridge and up the mountain, but again they found two roads and did not know which one to take. A little field mouse peeped through the leaves and grass, so they asked him, "Do you know where the Tongue Cut Sparrow went?" "Yes, down the mountain and through the woods," said the field mouse. Down the mountain and through the woods they went, and at last came to the home of their little friend. When he saw them coming, the poor little sparrow was very happy indeed. He and his wife and children all came and bowed their heads down to the ground to show their respect. Then the sparrow rose and led the old man and the old woman into his house, while his wife and children hastened to bring them boiled rice, fish, cress, and sake. After they had feasted, the sparrow wished to please them still more, so he danced for them what is called the sparrow dance. When the sun began to sink, the old man and woman started for home. The sparrow brought out 2 baskets. "I would like to give you one of these," he said. "Which will you take?" One basket was large and looked very full, while the other one seemed very small and light. The old people thought they would not take the large basket, for that might have all the sparrow's treasure in it. So they said, "The way is long, and we are very old, so please let us take the smaller one." They took it and walked home over the mountain across the bridge, happy and contented. When they reached their own home, they decided to open the basket and see what the sparrow had given them. Within the basket they found many rolls of silk and piles of gold, enough to make them rich, so they were more grateful than ever to the sparrow. The cross old woman who had cut the sparrow's tongue was peering in through the screen when they opened the basket. She saw the rolls of silk and the piles of gold, and planned how she might get some for herself. The next morning she went to the kind woman and said, "I am so sorry that I cut the tongue of your sparrow. Please tell me the way to his home, so that I may go to him and tell him I am sorry." The kind woman told her the way, and she set out. She went across the bridge, over the mountain, and through the woods. At last she came to the home of the little sparrow. He was not so glad to see this old woman, yet he was very kind to her and did everything to make her feel welcome. They made a feast for her, and when she started home, the sparrow brought out 2 baskets as before. Of course the woman chose the large basket, for she thought that would have even more wealth than the other one. It was very heavy and caught on the trees as she was going through the wood. She could hardly pull it up the mountain with her, and she was all out of breath when she reached the top. She did not get to the bridge until it was dark. Then she was so afraid of dropping the basket into the river that she scarcely dared to step. When at last she reached home, she was so tired that she was half dead, but she pulled the screens close shut so that no one could look in, and opened her treasure. Treasure indeed! A whole swarm of horrible creatures burst from the basket the moment she opened it. They stung her and bit her, they pushed her and pulled her, they scratched her and laughed at her screams. At last she crawled to the edge of the room and slid aside the screen to get away from the pests. The moment the door was opened, they swooped down upon her, picked her up, and flew away with her. Since then, nothing has ever been heard of the old woman. The final story I have for you today is Shipetaro. Brave Soldier was the name of a very brave man in Japan. One time he was going on a long journey. He had to go through woods and over mountains. He crossed rivers and plains. Near the end of his journey he came to a great forest. The trees were so thick and tall that the sun could never enter there. All day Brave Soldier hurried along the mossy path that led among the great tree trunks. He said to himself, "I must reach the next village before dark, or else I can find no place to sleep tonight." So he hastened on along the narrow path. After a time he seemed to be going up a mountainside. As he hurried on, it seemed to grow darker and darker. Brave Soldier knew that it was not late enough for night to be coming on. "There must be a storm coming," said Brave Soldier to himself, "for I hear the trees sighing and rustling. Now I must hurry, for I do not care to be out in a storm." So Brave Soldier walked as fast as he could and hoped that he would soon come to a village. The wind rushed through the treetops, and the rain hammered on the leaves far above him. It was so dark that Brave Soldier could hardly follow the path. "If I do not soon find some house or village, I shall lie down here under the trees for the night. They are my friends, and will not allow any harm to come to me." He had no more than said this when he came to a clearing in the trees. It was not quite so dark here, and Brave Soldier saw some kind of house standing in the middle of the open space. He went to it and found that it was an old ruined temple. It looked as though only bats had been there for 100 years. No palace ever seemed more welcome to anyone than this old ruined temple did to the tired traveler. He found the corner where the roof leaked the least, curled up in his cloak, and was soon fast asleep. In the middle of the night a terrible noise awakened him. Such a shrieking and yowling! It sounded like an army of cats, each trying to see who could make the most noise. When at last they stopped for a moment, perhaps to catch breath, Brave Soldier heard a voice say, "Remember, don't tell this to Shipetaro. All is lost if Shipetaro knows about it." "I wonder what they are up to," thought Brave Soldier. "I will just remember that name, Shipetaro, for he seems to be quite an important person around here. It is possible that I may meet him some day." Then he turned over and went to sleep. In the morning, when he awakened, the storm was past and the sun was shining. Now he had no trouble in finding his way, and soon came to a village. On all sides he heard a sound of weeping and crying. All were dressed in white, a sign that someone is dead or dying. "What is the matter? Who is dead?" he asked of an old man who sat by the roadside. Instead of answering, the old man pointed to a little cottage at the end of the street. Some little children were sitting in the doorway of a house. Brave Soldier said to them, "Can you tell me, little ones, why all the people in this village are weeping?" The children, too, only pointed to the same house at the end of the street. When the soldier came to this house, he saw an old man and an old woman weeping as though their hearts were broken. A little girl was trying to comfort them. "Do not weep so, dear grandmother," she said. "I am not afraid to go. I am sorry to leave you, but someone must go, and the other women in the village will take care of you when I am gone." "What is the matter?" asked Brave Soldier, coming up just then. "Where are you going, and why are all weeping so?" "I am going up to the temple tonight," answered the girl. "Every year someone must go, or else the monster will destroy the village. There is no one else to go this year, so I will go. They will put me in that basket you see by the door, and carry me up to an old temple in the woods, and leave me there. I don't know what happens then, for those who have gone have never come back." "Where is the temple?" asked Brave Soldier. "It is up that hill in the woods," said the girl, pointing to the very temple where he had spent the night. Brave Soldier remembered what he had heard there the night before, and he also remembered the name he had heard. "Is there anyone around here by the name of Shipetaro?" he asked. "Shipetaro? Why, that's our dog, and he is the nicest dog you ever saw, too." Just then a long, lean black dog came up and began to lick the hand of his mistress. "This is Shipetaro," said the girl. "Is he not a fine fellow? Everyone loves him." "Yes, indeed, he is a brave-looking dog," answered the man. "I want to borrow just such a dog as that for one night. Would you let me have him for so long?" "If you will bring him back, for he must stay here to take care of grandmother and grandfather," said the girl. Then Brave Soldier told her what he had heard in that same temple the night before. "I mean to put that brave dog into the basket instead of you and see what will happen. I will go along to see that no harm shall come to him." The dog seemed to understand what was wanted, and acted as though he was glad to go. They put him into the basket which had taken so many beautiful maidens to their death. Just before dark they carried him up through the listening woods to the temple. All but the soldier were afraid to stay, but he took out his good sword and lay calmly down. At midnight he heard the same frightful noises. He looked out and saw a troop of cats led by a large, fierce-looking tomcat. They gathered about the basket and tore open the cover. Out sprang the good Shipetaro with every hair bristling. He seized the tomcat, who was really the monster, and made short work of him. When the other cats saw their leader killed, they turned and fled like leaves before the wind. Then the soldier took the brave dog back to his mistress, and told the people how he had done what no man could have done, and saved the village from the monster. Do you wonder that all the people love Shipetaro and love to have his picture over their doors? They think that it will frighten away all evil. I hope you've enjoyed these 1904 adaptations of some classic Japanese folk tales. This book is in the public domain, so if you would like to share the stories or illustrations elsewhere, you can do so. And if you'd like to look up the original book, again, the author is Teresa Pierce Williston. Thank you so much for watching.